recapitulate. And please take it away. Thank you.
Okay, I am actually trying to start a timer myself so I don't go over, because one of the things I really don't like is when people go over like 45 minutes on a talk. I think nobody should have to sit longer than that. So I'm going to start with my conclusion, because it's going to maybe get lost if I don't make it clear where I'm going to end up at the end of this thing. And so what I want to argue is that argumentation may not be the best way to change minds. Right? I think there are limits to what argument can actually do for us. And the way I want to approach this is talking about the nature of epistemic responsibility and the nature of undesirable beliefs. And by undesirable beliefs, I mean specifically things like racist and sexist beliefs. You can add, homophobic beliefs, xenophobic beliefs. You can add the whole gamut of things we would consider undesirable, but I'm going to focus primarily on racist beliefs for this talk, but you can substitute your favorite undesirable belief. And so I want to start with, actually, one other thing is, this was supposed to be my second time I gave this talk. I had a lined up and practice talk that was going to be to get me ready for this particular talk. And the schedules got switched. So now you're getting the practice version of the talk. So if there's some rough edges, that's why. I really had planned to do this as a second go, not a first go. But I want to start with epistemic involuntarism and the idea that we don't often, or we many times don't choose our beliefs. So there's three beliefs I want to start with specifically. One is it's a sunny day. Second is the lights in my office are on. And third is girls are not good at math and science. And those three beliefs actually seem to be different in important kinds of ways. The first belief that it's a sunny day. I don't know where you are, but where I am, it is in fact a sunny day. You can probably tell from the way I'm lit. There's windows all around me. I can't help but believe that it's a sunny day. I don't have the choice of saying, oh, it's cloudy or it's rainy or it's snowy. I just believe it's a sunny day. The lights are on in my office is a slightly different belief, because I actually have indirect control over that. I can go over to the wall and I can turn the lights on and off at will, right? So if I want to believe the lights are on in my office, I flip the switch one direction. If I want to believe they're off, I turn the switch the other direction. And Richard Feldman, who came up with this example, hammers the point home by saying, look, if the chair of my department says that only people who believe that the lights are on in their office in the next 30 seconds are going to get a raise, he says, I'm going to make sure those lights are on. So I generate the right belief. So the third belief, girls aren't good at math and science. That is not clearly in either of these categories, right? The first belief that it's sunny outside, right? I don't have a choice if I believe that when the sun is out. But girls are good at math and science or aren't good at math and science doesn't seem to be exactly of that sort, because we do have the ability to influence our implicit beliefs to some extent. I can work on that belief and work on changing that belief, but it's clearly not of the sort that I can flip the light switch and make that belief change in the same way I can make the belief change that the lights are on in my office. So what are we to make of this? Well, I want to start by just focusing on the ways that epistemic involuntarism has been countered, and see if we can't sort of figure out what to make of undesirable beliefs in the first place. And then come back to the question of what makes a belief like girls aren't good at math and science undesirable, because that's an open question whether or not that's an undesirable belief, right? We might think so, but not everybody thinks that. So epistemic involuntarism, how do we counter it? I think there are more than 4 ways, but I'm going to talk about 4 ways. And the first one I'm going to get rid of fairly quickly, and that's just to deny it. That's just to say, no, we do choose our beliefs. I think that's a non-starter. I think if it were the case that we were able to choose our beliefs about race and about sex and all the other categories that we have undesirable beliefs about, the world would be a much better place because we wouldn't have to deal with things like implicit bias, right? So I'm gonna set that aside. The second option then is the option of flipping the light switch and changing our relationship to the evidentiary considerations. So in that case, we can say we have indirect control over our beliefs, right? I can't directly change my belief, but I can do something about the situation around me to change the evidence so that I generate the desired belief. And this is an option, but it's an option that works for perhaps some of our beliefs, but not all of our beliefs when it comes to the undesirable category. I can get to know people of different backgrounds, different races, right? I can put myself in a different position to try to change my beliefs. And I have a friend of mine who considers himself a recovering racist. He was raised in a small community in the South in the United States. His ancestors owned slaves. It was it's a very insular community. And he went out in the world and he saw a bigger perspective, right? He went to the university. He lived and worked overseas, right? He expanded his point of view. He actually was able to come to realize his former beliefs and to change some of them. But the reason he calls himself a recovering racist is he can't get rid of all of the vestiges of that background that he had, right? He didn't choose to accumulate these beliefs. He got them from his society and his community growing up. And he's done his best to get rid of them. But as he says, he still recognizes that in himself. So this indicates that maybe some of our undesirable beliefs, at least, are ones that we can't just flip a switch and change. It's not just a matter of changing our evidentiary position. The beliefs still linger. So the third option is that we have a compatibilist doxastic control. And this is the example of Carl and his BMW, right? So Carl parks his BMW, goes off to dinner, goes to a meeting, comes back, his car's not there. Now, he doesn't intentionally decide to believe his car is stolen, but he goes through the options. He thinks about, maybe he misremembered where his car is. He forgot that he gave the keys to a friend of his to borrow it for some event while he was busy at lunch, right? But he goes through the possibilities and he decides, but not necessarily intentionally, not necessarily consciously. He decides to believe that his car is stolen. And you can bring up the reasoning behind the beliefs. You can make that conscious, but you can't necessarily, sort of change the decision that someone makes. You can make it evident to them. And there's this notion that we choose our beliefs, we decide on our beliefs, but we don't always do it with an intentional nature. And this also seems to be the case with implicit beliefs. Right? With my implicit biases, I don't intend to think that girls are not good at math and science. I don't intend to think that people with a certain skin color may not be as intelligent or may not be as capable at their job, right? That I can become intentionally aware of that. But again, it's not like flipping the light switch. It doesn't go on and off easily. So there's a fourth way of changing beliefs or influencing beliefs, if the better terminology. And that is, right, the fact that we have doxastic influence, that we can put ourselves in a position through habitually acting in a certain way, right? And this gets into virtue epistemology, right? So we can be intellectually honest. We can be open-minded. We can be diligent. We can be careful. We can expose ourselves to the evidence fully, right? Not walk around with blinders on, and take into account all the evidence. And we can form habits that lead us to influence our beliefs, even if we cannot absolutely choose them. And there's empirical evidence for this, because they've done studies and they've found that people who have a second order desire, a second order belief to not be prejudiced, they don't want to be biased, they don't want to have their implicit beliefs influencing their behavior towards others in the world. Those people tend to be less biased than other people, right? They tend to have fewer implicit biases. And so there's this last way of influencing your beliefs indirectly through habitual action is also consistent with taking into account doxastic mechanisms, right? So the introspection, the sensory evidence that you see with Carl and his introspective beliefs. It's also consistent with the cognitive situatedness of putting yourself in a different position evidentiarily with respect to the evidence. And it's in this idea that we don't necessarily have direct control of our beliefs, but we do have at least indirect influence, that I think we can say that we have some doxastic responsibility, some responsibility for our racist and sexist beliefs. Because the problem is, if you go with involuntarism and we're not responsible for our beliefs at all, then you can't be responsible for your undesirable beliefs. So there has to be a means, if you're going to be responsible for undesirable beliefs, for being responsible for beliefs in general. And that's the first part of this. And it's one of the reasons I think that argument isn't always the best way to change people's minds, because we don't have the sort of direct control over our beliefs that we do. Say, I can raise my hand. And when I raise my hand, right, I can do it, I can not do it. I can't believe it's a sunny day or not a sunny day. I can't immediately change my implicit biases and get rid of them, even though I know that I have them, right? I would love to get rid of my implicit biases. What do? I can influence them. I can work on them over time by developing the right sorts of habits. So that's the first consideration. The second consideration, I think, is actually much more difficult to deal with. And that is the nature of undesirability and what constitutes an undesirable belief. And I think actually to explain the problem most clearly, I want to start with a story from Studs Terkel. He went around and recorded a bunch of people's stories in the 20th century. And one of the stories he recorded was of a Ku Klux Klansman, C.P. Ellis. And C.P. Ellis changed his mind. He renounced his white supremacist beliefs and became an advocate for inclusion. And he was a fighter of against desegregation, to becoming somebody who was in favor of it. And he did this presumably by getting to know people who were Black and people who were Jewish. And he discovered that, you know, they're kind of just like me. But when he changes his mind, his old former compatriots come to him and they say, "You're selling us out. Get out of my door. I don't want to see you anymore. I don't want to talk to you." To them, his change of heart was not a desirable one. He went from believing something that they thought was true to something that they thought was false, because after all, none of us intentionally have false beliefs, right? None of us go around saying, oh, I want to believe falsely. So the white supremacist thinks that their beliefs are the desirable ones, and that those of us who are opposed to that view have the undesirable beliefs. So how do we really talk about undesirability, and why is there a problem with saying, racist beliefs are undesirable? Well, undesirability, I think, depends on context to a great extent, and it will become clear why I think that shortly. But because it's contextual, it's not something that you can provide necessary and sufficient conditions for. But Nikolai Nodelman gives us a place to start in thinking about it. So he does try to provide these necessary and sufficient conditions. And I want to start with his view and then sort of work to where I think the problem is. So Nodelman says what makes a belief undesirable is three things. First, it's either not true or it doesn't reliably lead to truth. There's no reliable process involved. So that seems pretty straightforward. Right? If a belief is true, it might be inconvenient, it might be unhappy, it might be something we don't want to accept, but it hardly seems to be undesirable in the particular kind of way I'm talking about. The second thing is that the beliefs don't have good justifying reasons. They don't have adequate support. And the example of this kind of thing would be the guy who came up with the idea of continental drift in the 19th century. Right? He looks at this map and he says, oh, look, Africa kind of fits in with South America, and you can tuck India in. And maybe everything was really at one time some big giant landmass. Well, we think that now, but in the 19th century, they didn't understand that the continents were floating on basically a liquid bed of magma and could move. There was no understanding of the mechanism by which these massive hunks of land could ever get anywhere. And so everybody said, that's a nice idea, but no. Right? So it turned out in the long run, it was a true idea, but it did not have adequate grounds. Third condition Nodelman gives is that the person who holds the belief has to have those adequate grounds, right? And that's the problem of, there might be a true belief out there that has adequate grounds, but if I don't have the adequate grounds, right, the belief is still undesirable for me to hold because I don't have the justifying reasons at my fingertips. And there's an example of this from to bring it back to race in the history of philosophy from David Hume, of all people, right? Hume's one of the stalwarts of philosophy. And Hume was familiar with this black-skinned Jamaican named Francis Williams. And Francis Williams was a pretty bright guy, bright enough that he became the subject of an intellectual dispute during Hume's day. He went to Cambridge. He was a lawyer. He wrote poetry in Latin, no less. And his gifts were so remarkable that people around started debating whether or not people of darker skin were actually intellectually inferior. And this is what Hume said when he weighed in on the subject. He says, in Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but 'tis likely he was admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. Right. So Hume has this evidence in front of him of a black-skinned man, succeeds in Cambridge, writes poetry, very gifted, and compares him to a parrot uttering a few words of English. Right? And of course, in Hume's famous quote on race, he actually doubles down on this and he says, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent in either action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, no sciences, and one could add no poetry. Right. So here's Hume. He's got the evidence in front of him of a Negro, black-skinned, highly intelligent individual. And Hume lets his biases, his preconceived notion about the nature of race, influence his belief about this particular person. And the thing that happens in many respects is the evidence that we have to confront when we bump up against the world gets colored by these underlying beliefs and these underlying biases and these underlying prejudices that we have. But who's to say which of these underlying beliefs and which of these underlying prejudices are the right ones or the wrong ones? And this brings us to the topic of truth, that first criterion. And here's the real problem. We live in a world in which many, many people talk about things being true for me, or the phrase "speaking my truth" is a popular expression. Right? We live in a post-truth world. Post-truth was the 2016 Oxford Dictionary's word of the year. Right? And here's how they define post-truth: relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. All right. One more time. Objective facts are less important than personal belief or emotion. All right. Nobody intentionally goes around believing what they think is false. And so how did we get ourselves in this position where it's all narrative and it's all, sort of, I have one narrative, you have another narrative, I'm speaking my truth, you're speaking your truth. And, the conservatives, at least here in the United States, speak of this quite openly, that, and one narrative is as good as any other. So if my narrative doesn't match with your narrative, that's fine. You have your truth, I have my truth, which is the undesirable belief. Well, I think the way we got ourselves into this, at least partially, is postmodernism, which of course nobody can really define in a nice, concise sort of way, but it is this idea that everything can be interpreted and reinterpreted because it's all a matter of political ideology. And this comes from a lot of philosophers, but 2 in particular that I want to talk about, Rorty and Foucault. Right? And Rorty is pretty upfront about his view of truth, and he says, there's nothing to be said about truth, save that each of us will commend as true those beliefs which he or she finds good to be true. Now, Rorty is no subjectivist. Rorty sounds like a subjectivist there, but, at worst, he's a relativist. I think he's a relativist. He would say he's not a relativist, but either way, it comes down to community. And communities cannot justify themselves in Rorty's view, right? We have this idea of a lonely provincialism. And the way we believe is maybe not the way we will continue to believe. It's maybe not the way we've always believed. It's the way we believe right now. And the world that we bump up against is really constituted by those beliefs, those truths that we aren't currently objecting to or debating or arguing about at that particular moment. And Foucault takes this, he doesn't take it literally, but Foucault takes the same idea and gives it a political power shift, right? Foucault is a little bit darker in his assessment. Rorty has a lot of hope for our ability, what he calls, the wet liberals, their view to win out. Foucault is much more about the power involved and the way power shapes our understanding of truth. And I have a semi-long view of Foucault, but quote from Foucault. And then I want to directly apply it to something that happened here within the last month in the United States. So Foucault says, truth is a thing of this world. It's produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint, and it induces regular effects of power. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true. The mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedure accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. Now, there's the case in the United States that just went to trial. The trial is finished now, but it happened within the last month, was of Alex Jones, who was a Sandy Hook conspiracy theorist who said the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School never happened. And one of the parents sued him in court to basically get damages for the kind of destruction that this caused for their lives. And Jones is on the stand, and he has this exchange with the judge. And the judge tells him as he's testifying, she says, "It seems absurd to instruct you again that you must tell the truth when you testify. Yet here I am. You must tell the truth when you testify. This isn't your show." And Jones comes back and he says, but he believes what he says is true. And the judge responds, you believe everything you say is true, but it isn't. Your beliefs do not make something true. That's what we're doing here. Just because you claim to think something is true does not make it true. And this is exactly the kind of thing Foucault is talking about. You have a judge, an authority from the government, dictating what constitutes the kind of truth that Jones is allowed to speak on the stand, right? And Jones is saying, no. I think I'm telling the truth. And the judge is coming down and saying, no, this is not an authorized truth. You can't believe this. And I think we all have sympathy with this view that you can't believe it. But what I've been concerned about is why one sort of truth gets the moniker of truth, why the political power gets to say this constitutes truth, and other views don't get to the moniker of truth, right? And it's not as easy as just saying, well, this is the view we believe on, which is kind of the Rortian sort of view. Our community, we, the wet liberals, right, agree to this, because there's other communities that don't, and they have their own views about desirability and undesirability. So truth may be what we make it, but we need to be able to say some beliefs are genuinely undesirable. Our racist and sexist beliefs are genuinely undesirable. The last thing I want to talk about then is go back to C.P. Ellis for a minute, the Klansman who renounces his views. Ellis is very self-reflective about this, and he has things to say about his former associates. And he says that it disturbs me when people who do not really know what it's all about are so very critical of individual Klansmen. The majority of them are low-income whites, people who don't really have a part in something. They have been shut out as well as the blacks. Some are not very well educated either, like myself, right? So if you do the Foucault thing and you look at power on multiple axes, right? To be white is to have power on one axis, but the people who may, not all of them, but may be white supremacists are disadvantaged perhaps in areas of education and wealth. And so there's this complexity of, am I responsible for my racist beliefs if I come from an impoverished background? If I come from an insular community in which that's what I'm taught to believe, the authorities in that area are telling me that that is what I should believe. And C.P. Ellis has a comment on that too. He talks about the congressman, or not the congressman, the city councilman and the county commissioners coming up to him, coming up to his associates, the ones who are not well educated, the ones who are not particularly well off financially. And he says, they came to us and they began to call us friend. They'd call us at night on the telephone. CP, glad you came to that meeting last night. They didn't want integration either, but they did it secretly to get elected. They couldn't stand up and openly say it, but they were glad somebody was saying it. We visited some of the city leaders in their home to talk to them privately. It wasn't long before councilmen would come up to me. The blacks are coming up tonight making outrageous demands. How about some of you people showing up and having a little balance? Right? Ellis is being told by people in authority that he needs to make a stand for segregation. And if we don't have some way of distinguishing truth, maybe not capital T truth, but we need some way of saying, here's what constitutes truth. Go back to the notion of undesirable beliefs. They're the ones that don't lead to reliable processes and don't lead to truth. We lose our ability to make demarcations between which beliefs count as desirable and which beliefs don't count as desirable. So that brings me back to my conclusion then. And my conclusion is that ultimately argument may not be the best way to change minds, because beliefs aren't the kinds of things that we have direct control over, like we have, sort of raising your hand and putting it down. And if our beliefs lie outside our direct control, and we have communities of belief that are influencing our beliefs in ways that lead to not outright racism, perhaps, maybe not outright sexism, but an undercurrent, a systemic notion of racist and sexist practices, right? This may be something for which I am not always responsible for, in the same way I'm responsible for raising my hand or not, for helping somebody, helping my neighbor, or choosing not to help my neighbor. On the other hand, we are able to affect and influence our beliefs through our values. And again, there's empirical evidence to support, if I have a value of being open-minded, if I have a value of not being a prejudiced person, this actually has an impact on my behavior and has an impact on my underlying implicit biases. So that the focus, perhaps if we want to change people's minds, could be on argument if we can find common ground with people to argue. And the key has to be finding common ground and engaging with people in ways that they will accept. But short of that, right, looking at values and talking to people about the values and what we hold to be important, and getting people to consciously reflect about that. And I would love to conclude by saying, I have a solution to the problem of how we're supposed to get rid of our racist and sexist and homophobic and xenophobic beliefs. I was talking to my students yesterday about this same topic, and was telling them I'm giving this talk, and give me some answers. If you got some answers, I would love to have them. I don't have answers, but what I do have is a suspicion that argument isn't going to get us all the way to where we need to be. So That's it.
Thank you so much. That was helpful. So sorry, I'm gonna stop recording.